Hello, everybody, and welcome to our video lecture for today's class. So I know this is kind of a strange film, and it's an important film, even though it was just released in 2017. It's considered to be kind of Paul Schrader's masterpiece, and so that's why I'm devoting 2 days to it. I am going to leave most of the plot and the character stuff for the discussion leaders to take up on Thursday. I'm not going to step on any toes there. And instead, today, I am going to concentrate mostly on Paul Schrader's filmmaking style because it is very distinctive. You may have had a sense that this is different from a lot of films that you have watched before. And you may have been able to articulate why, or maybe not. I'm going to try to explain why the film feels kind of strange, talk about his filmmaking style, and we can use that to help inform our discussion of the plot and the themes and the characters on Thursday. But I just want to make sure we cover it. So, you may not have heard of Paul Schrader before, but it's very likely that you have encountered his work because Paul Schrader is less famous. I guess his solo work is a little bit less famous, but he is well known, I guess, for his collaborations with Martin Scorsese. Paul Schrader was part of that new Hollywood generation of the late 60s and the 70s that also included guys like Francis Ford Coppola and Roman Polanski, kind of this somewhat darker, more adult era of post-code filmmaking that came about in the 1970s and produced, not just this, but like Brian De Palma's work and stuff like The Godfather and these kind of darker, somewhat more, I guess, cynical films. And unlike, I guess, Coppola and Scorsese, um, Paul Schrader is not Catholic. A lot of the religious themes that come up in Coppola and Scorsese's work come from their Catholicism. Schrader's background is actually Protestant, and I think that you will observe some of the Protestant influence, not just on the main character here, but on the style of the filmmaking. So, in addition to this one, Paul Schrader actually has 18 feature films to his name. So, he is quite prolific. He's been making films for a long time, but they tend to be independently funded, smaller features, and so not big blockbusters like what you see with Martin Scorsese. But, if you've seen Taxi Driver or Raging Bull, Paul Schrader was the screenwriter for films like that, and helped bring those films to fruition, even though they are usually, we think of them as Scorsese films. Okay, so like I said, Paul Schrader has a Protestant background, and specifically, he was raised in the Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So you can go back to that giant tree of Protestant denominations that I showed you earlier in the semester if you would like to. But just as kind of a refresher, the Christian Reformed tradition comes from continental Europe and was heavily influenced by Calvinism. So you probably have some sense that this is a film with deep Calvinist influences. This is a somewhat bleak world in which this young minister lives, and not really a young minister, but in which this middle-aged minister lives. And Calvinism is kind of permeates the entire feel of the film. So he says that it's a Calvinist denomination, which at that time prescribed theater attendance and other worldly amusements. So the Christian Reformed tradition actually, like a lot of the kind of old European denominations, has conservative and liberal branches. And Schrader would have grown up in a pretty conservative version of this. If you remember back when I talked about the fundamentalist modernist split, fundamentalists in the middle of the 20th century, or more conservative Christian Protestants at the middle of the 20th century, tended to be what we call separatist, meaning that they sought to kind of opt out of a lot of aspects of modern life. And that included like exposure to a lot of pop culture. So it would have been very, very common in a conservative tradition at this time for people not to go to movies or to not listen to rock and roll or other kinds of popular music. And the idea being that those were somehow things that were kind of contaminating, either because they promoted, like, I guess, a sinful or promiscuous lifestyle, or simply because they were entertainment oriented. There is an idea in some conservative Protestant traditions that pure entertainment is kind of bad for you. and that you want to be using that time in order to kind of concentrate on your spiritual life and concentrating on improving yourself um, in a spiritual way. So this, as it does with a lot of young people, backfired spectacularly with Schrader. He says, I was drawn to the forbidden, not the forbidden, of course, but the acceptable forbidden. So he, was very attracted to films at the time, but he wanted to try to find a way to, he says, square my love of movies with my religious upbringing. So to find a way of appreciating movies and making films that was kind of consistent with his religious background. Um, Paul Schrader, in addition to being a filmmaker, was actually a film scholar. He went to graduate school and wrote this book called The Transcendental Style in Film, in which he studied the work of these three directors, two European and one Japanese, and identified something he was observing in the middle of the 20th century. This is in the 1960s that he was writing this, called the Transcendental Style. Okay, and so it's an attempt to try to explain how religion influences a style of filmmaking in addition to the stories that are being told. And I'll talk about the specific features of the transcendental style, but the overall goals that Schrader attributes to the transcendental style is the expression in religion and art that attempts to bring man as close to the ineffable, invisible, and unknowable as words, images, and ideas can take him. So, this attempt to bring the human viewer into contact with something, with mystery, into contact with the divine, that which can't quite be perceived. He says transcendental style seeks to maximize the mystery of existence. It eschews all conventional interpretations of reality, realism, naturalism, psychologism, romanticism, expressionism, impressionism, and finally rationalism. Okay, so he's declaring that this is a very different style of filmmaking. And the example that is the most relevant for First Reformed is a film from 1951 by Robert Bresson. It's a French film called The Diary of a Country Priest. And by the way, the book that is the basis for this film in is mentioned in Gilead. So if you recognize the name, that's where you have seen it before recently. And Diary of a Country Priest is obviously a very big influence on First Reformed because it is also the story of a very depressed young priest who comes to this small town in France and has this kind of you can go and watch it for yourself or go and look it up. But it is also a very kind of dark story about a man of the cloth, a clergyman who is wrestling with himself and also wrestling with his faith. Um, the specific features of the transcendental style that are seen both in Diary of a Country Priest and other films in this style, and also in First Reformed, is that it tries to strip away a lot of the features of filmmaking that mediate the experience of viewing a film. Okay. So, and what I mean by mediate is the kind of effects that help tell you how to feel, essentially. So typically in feature films, we have music or, music that is composed to accompany the film. And this music kind of guides us on the emotional journey. It kind of tells us how we're supposed to be feeling about that particular moment. The transcendental style gets rid of this. You may have noticed that there are only a couple of points at which we actually get music, and the places where Schrader uses music are very, very deliberate. And instead of music, what you get is these heightened sound effects. So I would encourage you to go back, and if we were all in class today, this doesn't work well on Zoom, so I couldn't have really done it well here. But if we were in class, I would have shown that opening shot in which the camera zooms in on the church, and all we hear is kind of the sounds of nature. Okay, so there's a lot of use of natural sound effects that might be amplified in some ways to make them clearer or even harsher instead of music. Also, these films tend to use a narrower screen ratio, so it doesn't take up your entire screen, and much less color. So you'll notice that there's a lot of black and white. That church is completely white inside. and it contrasts very, very nicely with the black of the minister's vestments. Transcendental style also does things like focus on everyday objects. So if you may also remember that from some of the opening shots of of First Reformed, we get these close-ups on very kind of mundane or seemingly unimportant objects. We get the rack of pamphlets in the church. We get the minister's robe. We get the offering plate. A lot of focus on these just very conventional, unremarkable objects. The transcendental style also uses minimal editing, or what is called in filmmaking coverage. Okay, so typically, when, say, a scene of dialogue is being filmed, there will be a lot of cuts and a lot of editing. So usually a dialogue scene will be filmed from multiple different directions. Um, Often, where they will, like, the actors will perform the dialogue and it is filmed from one direction, then they'll perform it again and it's filmed from another direction, and so that we have different camera angles showing us different perspectives on that conversation. We'll see it briefly from one person's point of view and then another person's point of view, and then we'll have a two shot where we see both people in the shot. So, if you go back and watch a more conventional film, you'll notice this a lot, that this is coverage. This is where there's a lot of editing back and forth between different characters' perspectives and different ways of looking at that particular conversation. So you may have noticed that when we saw this first scene of dialogue between Amanda Seyfried's character and Toller, that it might have seemed a little bit boring, or kind of like you were just watching two people talking, like were kind of peeping in through a window, because it uses very minimal coverage, very minimal editing. The camera stays on this two shot of the two of them talking to each other for a very long time. It also does this in the preceding scene, in which we just get this wide shot, so where the camera is way zoomed out, from the back of the sanctuary, in which she goes up and talks to him. And we don't really get a close up until later when they are actually having this discussion. So it almost has the feel of like the camera is just spying on them and just happens to pick them up. But part of what this is doing is, again, it is removing those layers of mediation. It's removing all of these different filmmaking effects that give it a sense that things are happening, or at least more than what we are actually seeing in the scene. That we're being guided to see the scene from different characters' perspectives. This kind of filmmaking is not really providing any guidance at all. It's very stripped down and very, very plain. You may also have had the sense that scenes go on a little bit longer than you would have expected. So, like, there's this great shot in which we just watch for a long time Toller's very beat up looking car pulling up in front of the house where he meets with this young couple for the first time. So there will be these very long takes in which it just feels like the scene is going on way, way, way too long without anything happening. Or the camera is just sitting there in one place on a very simple shot like this one for a very long time. And again, that's removing all these layers of mediation. We also get very minimalist acting in the transcendental style. So there, except for perhaps at the end, and that's an important moment that we'll talk about momentarily. The acting here is quite minimalist. We don't get a lot of big emotions. Nobody's making huge speeches and crying or screaming at each other. It's not it. There's the sense that this film is very dramatic, but it's for reasons other than the acting. It's even when the characters are very sad or feeling big emotions, they don't really show them that much. All in all, like these actors are doing almost denying us the opportunity to empathize with them, because like in key moments their faces are actually turned away or their faces are obscured, so we're kind of left to imagine what is going on inside them rather than being told what is going on inside them through the acting. So what does all of this add up to? So in Schrader's own words, delaying edits, not moving the camera, forswearing music cues, not employing coverage, heightening the mundane, through all of these techniques, the transcendental style creates a sense of unease in the viewer that must resolve. Okay, and unease, I think, is a great adjective to describe how this film feels. It feels very uneasy. It feels slightly disturbed, even though there's nothing, big happening throughout most of the film, even though there's nothing seemingly that dramatic happening in most of the film. So, what this does is it creates this sense of tension that then must be released. And it is released in these very key moments. So we'll talk about those moments in a second. But before that, I want to remind us of the meaning of the term transcendence. So, a little bit earlier, we talked about the distinction between the immanence and the transcendence of God, these two different ideas of how God operates in the world. And the idea of God's immanence is that God is present in nature, and therefore that his impact on the world is seen through nature itself. The idea of the transcendence of God is the idea that God is separate from nature, so that when God acts on nature, it is breaking from the natural order in some way. Okay, so I brought this up originally in the context of this conservative and modernist split in American Protestantism and said that the liberal or modernist side of things became more concerned with God's immanence, so how God works through nature. We see this in Emerson. We see this actually quite a bit in Gilead, where John Ames is talking about kind of how he experiences God, how he experiences contact with the divine through seemingly mundane natural events. And I also said that the conservative tradition tends to emphasize God's transcendence, so God's separateness from the natural order, that he then intervenes into humans' lives or into nature in some way in order to in order to make himself known. The truth is that pretty much all religious traditions are able to kind of contain both of these ideas. It's not that liberals don't believe in the transcendence of God or that conservatives don't believe God can be immanent in nature. It's merely that they tend to emphasize one over the other. Okay. So the reason why this is called the transcendental style is because the idea is that you emphasize all of these mundane details. You kind of refuse to in any way like weigh in too heavily on what the emotional feeling of the moment is supposed to be. You create this very kind of almost stripped down, boring style of filmmaking so that moments of transcendence can occur, moments in which the divine enters the ordinary world and transforms it. So basically, what Schrader is doing is he's setting up this whole visual vocabulary. Like, he kind of tells you, here's how a typical scene in this film is going to go. I'm not going to change camera angles very much. I'm not going to use music. My actors are going to be very restrained and not going to come out and show you exactly what's going on inside of them, so that at key moments, the divine or the spiritual can enter the picture and completely change those rules, completely disrupt those rules. So there are key moments in this film in which that visual language that he has established is disrupted, is changed in like a really really dramatic moment, and that occurs twice. Um, but before we look at those specific moments, let me also kind of remind you that we can kind of draw an analogy between this style of filmmaking and kind of the Protestant ethos in general. Okay, so if you recall, a lot of Protestantism was about removing those layers of mediation between God and his people, between God and the regular Christian believer. So you might have noticed, like, and it's completely on purpose, I am sure, that the church in this film is very bare. Like, it's completely white walls. We see most of the people in the pews are all wearing like black or gray. It's very austere. There's not a lot of decoration except for these white flowers. And again, the reason why Protestant churches have tended to look like this is, again, it's about removing that mediation. When we look at a film that's set in a Catholic church later on, you will notice the difference. That there's supposed to be no division between God and his people here. The priest is the minister is there merely to kind of speak and to offer a lesson for everyone, but he is not there to represent God necessarily to the people the way it would be in the Catholic tradition. So just as this filmmaking style seeks to get rid of layers of mediation between the filmmaker and the audience, so like the Protestant aesthetic tries to remove layers of mediation between God and the people. Okay, and so then when we get these moments where the divine enters the picture, or when people have a spiritual experience, we get this disruption. So I'm going to let you guys talk about these specific scenes in the discussion thread some, but you may have noticed that this particular scene is really the first time that the camera moves in a big way. So for our discussion thread, I would encourage you to go back and watch this scene. This is the scene where Taller is sitting and eating his dinner, and then Amanda Seyfried comes in, and they have this kind of the little flying um, experience here. A very, very strange moment. I understand, but like important. It's important to understand the filmmaking style so that you can understand what's happening here. But I'm gonna let you guys kind of interpret what's happening in the scene. And then, of course, the second moment in which this occurs is at the end. So where again the film will break the visual rules that it has established, the style of filmmaking that we have been given so far, in order to allow these characters to experience a moment of transcendence, a moment of contact with the divine. Okay, so with that, I am going to uh, direct you back to the discussion thread so that we can talk about the moments where we see Schrader's transcendental style coming through, and particularly focusing on these two scenes in which, like again, like I said, all of the rules that the film has established for us are broken momentarily.